called caffeine 4. This is traditionally called, in conference speak, the graveyard slot. But hopefully I will keep you awake one way or another. Donna tells me that I should introduce myself. I am Jonathan Culpeper. I'm of the same generation as two other people whom you've met already. You'll probably guess who they are. Eleanor Samino and Tony McHenry. We were all appointed within a year or two of each other. We were all PhD students at the same time, early 1990s. And we've all sort of gathered one way or another around Corpus Linguistics, which is why I'm talking to you today about this. And what I'm specifically talking about is Shakespeare and Shakespeare's language. I never claim to be a Shakespearean. I see myself as a linguist, and specifically a historical corpus linguist, who happens to be interested in Shakespeare's language. I have written on Shakespeare's language separately, but I'm interested in the broader frame of things, and the methods by which we can re-evaluate Shakespeare's language, etc. That's really what I'm about. And today I'm going to talk about myths, and there are lots of those, lots of myths about language. I'm going to talk about just about the ones associated with Shakespeare, and there are a lot. And one of the reasons I've chosen that is because corpus linguistics is a thoroughly empirical method, and using corpus linguistic methods, we can actually debunk some of those myths, and that's exactly what I'm going to do. So, a quick line-up coming up. I need to define it, don't I, what actually a myth is. We're doing that. And then I'm going to be covering the following myths about Shakespeare's language. 1. Shakespeare's language is wholly Shakespeare's language. I know it might sound kind of obvious, but I'm going to start with that one. Shakespeare had a larger vocabulary than any other writer, and for that one, I don't need to do it myself. There are 2 brilliant papers on it, and I'm going to be particularly drawing on Craig and adding on little bits around that. Shakespeare coined more words than any other writer. We're talking about that one, and I'm going to be doing quite a substantial digression on counting words, because we all do it. I mean, most corpus methods rely on word counts at one point or another. And then I'm going to be looking at this idea, Shakespeare's language transcends time and space. And I'm going to be talking about the word bastard. And finally, Shakespeare had small Latin, meaning he didn't know much Latin. And he had poor education, which is a myth out there. Various digressions. Because my idea is I'm going to hang all sorts of things off those myths and the discussion of them. Things that are of broader relevance. And it's going to be stuff to do with methods, stuff to do with tools, stuff to do with counting, etc., etc., etc. So hopefully it will broaden the interest of the whole thing. Okay, so what is a myth? A language myth. Well, there are various works on this. I could have looked at Lippy Green, I could have looked at James and Leslie Milroy, etc., etc. I love this book. It's actually the shortest essays, actually, in an essay poem by Laurie Bow and Peter Trudgill. Brilliant book. It actually doesn't really define what a language myth is. And even though I love the book, I couldn't find the definition. And now looking around other works, I didn't actually like any of the definitions I saw, so I decided I'd do my own. And this is what I would take as a language myth. I'll read it out. Language myths are beliefs about language that are produced and reproduced within particular communities and become part of a cultural ideology or folk wisdom that is used to evaluate language and account for how it is. They are inconsistent with the observed linguistic facts. As you can see what I'm going to do, I'm going to pick up on the myths that circulate around Shakespeare, and I'm going to use corpus linguistics to try and get at those empirical observed facts, if you like. That's the game plan. Okay, so first one, Shakespeare's language is wholly Shakespeare's language. Can you use that term, Shakespeare's language? Because you're implying that you can identify it. And that's the problem for me. Think about it from the point of view of a linguist. I'm going to investigate Shakespeare's language. How much of his language do we have? 1%, if we're lucky, probably less. Because the bulk of it was spoken language, and we don't have any of that. So the idea of going off to look at Shakespeare's language really is totally absurd. We can't do it, you would think. What we have are a few literary texts. And there are even problems with those. Let's go through some of those problems. One, an author in that period, and we're talking about 400 years ago, had no clear authorial oversight or control over what was printed. And bear in mind that 36 of his, I say his, purportedly to be his, plays were put together and published in 1623. He'd been dead for 7 years. So if I get something published, I send it off to the publisher. In fact, today I was looking at the proofs for an article, and I'm making changes and checking they got it right. Occasionally they don't. Often they don't. Shakespeare couldn't do that because he was in the grave. So there's no, that's what. And then actually, the rights for publication, he wouldn't have controlled that even in his lifetime. He would have sold those plays to a publisher, and he had no control over them at all. So they can make changes at will. And there's no copyright infringement or anything like that. So he's not controlling what actually gets printed. That's the first thing to bear in mind. Then also, 18 plays, I've mentioned 1623, but 18 plays have been previously published as so-called quartos, but they're a bit dodgy because sometimes, well, I say dodgy because we actually think that some of them maybe were constructed from memory. Someone was sitting in the audience, making notes, whizzed out there, wrote it up, and flogged it to a publisher. So we don't know for sure that he ever wrote all of it, probably some of it, but not all of it. And then the notion of a play text, if I want to read a play, or study a play, I can go into Blackwell's on campus, pull it off the shelf and buy it. Now, that notion of a whole play didn't really exist. It was like a bundle of fragments of bits and pieces put together, and in different performances, they would chuck some bits out and pop other bits in. It was a much more fluid and flexible thing. So the notion of a play was different. Then collaboration amongst playwrights was well known. They were writing bits and bobs together. So we know this was happening. So the idea that Shakespeare wrote X is already a little bit dicey because that would be going against what we know generally happened at the time, that there was lots of sharing and all the rest of it. Moreover, plagiarism, which I tell my students they should not do, otherwise get kicked out of university. But it had another spin. In that period, if you're copying someone, you're paying them a compliment. You thought their stuff was so good, you're going to echo it in your own work. So it's an entirely different look at stuff. So this whole business of Shakespeare's language is a bit tricky. What we can say, I think, is Shakespeare's language equals surviving written texts that purport to represent, for the most part, the language that Shakespeare produced for his literary works. Something like that is a reasonable approximation of what we're doing here. It's the best we can do. We can't do any more. It's always worth bearing this one in mind. Okay. So, what exactly was the contribution made by other authors to Shakespeare's works and vice versa? Because I mentioned collaboration. Can we trace that collaboration? Do we know that Christopher Marlowe was penning some bits of plays that we thought were written by Shakespeare? Well, this brings us into the realms of authorship attribution, where we try and attribute the words to particular authors. And actually, in this area, which is an area of Shakespearean literary scholarship, it actually overlaps a bit with forensic linguistics, which I think Claire Hardacre was talking to you about. So, quite a bit of overlap there. So the game plan here is to find bits of text that you can establish as written by Shakespeare as opposed to other people and vice versa. This is quite pertinent because in 2016 there was a new edition of the Oxford Shakespeare, and in it we find Christopher Marlowe credited as the co-author of the Henry VI plays. We find Thomas Middleton, now a co-author of All's Well That Ends Well, and Arden of Faversham, which you might have never heard before. That is now being added to the Shakespeare canon and credit given to Shakespeare for that. The question is, how do they do it? What's the basis for those decisions? And it's the authorship attribution stuff. And they were working with word Ngrams. You may have heard of Ngrams, but I'm going to give a little rehearsal of what all that's about right now. So, I will finish this lecture shortly. There's my sentence. Let's divide it up into word n-grams. Here we are. These are 2-word n-grams. So you have I will, move along your 2-word window 1 along, and you get will finish, then finish this, and then this lecture, and then lecture shortly. Those are 2-word n-grams. You can do it for 3-word. I will finish, we'll finish this lecture, etc., etc. Those are your word n-grams. Then you can count up how many times those occur in a text. Obviously, in this very short text, you've only got one I will. But in a longer text, you might have the same I will somewhere else. So you can do a frequency count on those, so you can find out the different types of n-grams and also how frequently they occur. That is exactly what Gary Taylor and Gabriel Egan did in order to establish who was writing what in Shakespeare. So what they were doing is this. They were asking questions like, does the disputed text have more n-gram types, different n-grams in common with Shakespeare's works or Marlowe's works? And does the disputed text favour the kind of n-grams in terms of frequency in the way that Shakespeare's works do or Marlowe's? Now, there's a little bit of a problem lurking over there because to get off the starting block, you have to be sure about what some of the text that Shakespeare was writing to establish what is typical of Shakespeare, right? And ditto, you have to be, if you're going to compare it with Marlowe, you've got to have some text where you're sure that Marlowe wrote them. Okay, so you can use contextual evidence. Was it in a register at the time? Were people talking about it? Were there reviews? You know, some commentators would go and see a performance of whatever and say, write about it. So you can take that contextual evidence, you know, and that's our evidence of saying it's Shakespeare or Marlowe, and then you do your comparison in this kind of way, etc., etc. This is essentially how it is working. But my bugbear with attribution studies is that they don't account for meaning. I go to conferences, and I'm always quite hopeful that we'll get along splendidly because they're using some of the methods that I recognise. But actually, their goals are very different from mine. And what they're doing with language is very different from what I would do with it. And that's what I want to talk about next and give you an example at the end of what I would do with n-grams. So, attribution scholars, they have what I think it's not just me, it's been referred to as the bag of words approach to language. I thought I'd illustrate this. We take a bag of flour on the left, and then we have a bag of potatoes on the right. And so what they have to do is distinguish whether we've got a bag of flour or we've got a bag of potatoes. And once you can work that out, you then say, oh, that one's off to the miller, who clearly produced that one, and this one is off to the potato farmer, who clearly produced that one. That is not what a linguist would do. I would say that the linguist has the bag of ingredients approach to language. If you're going to cook a dish in language, you need to have a certain structure to what you do to the ingredients. If you're making an omelette, you break the eggs and mix them, and then you pour it into a pan. You don't put the eggs into a pan and start stirring them with the shells on. Yeah, there's a certain order and structure to things. It's exactly the same with language. Language has structure, and how you structure it will result in particular meanings, particular tasty dishes, if you like. So I would say the corpus linguist has a rather different goal compared with the pure attribution person, who's not worried about how things are structured. It's just a matter of finding those patterns which will enable us to establish who wrote what. And that's the difference. So I thought I would talk a little bit at this point about what I've done with n-grams, which involve Shakespeare and other writers. What you see here are the most frequent 3-word n-grams in Shakespeare, compared with contemporary writers, early modern plays, and also present-day plays. I thought that would be interesting. Now, the colouring here, you will see, refers to whether there's a repetition. That's all. Now, there are various things we can say about this. I'm just going to give you a few. If you look at Shakespeare, one of the things you'll note is there's a dominance of I going on. Shakespeare likes I, and not just in n-grams. It's a particular Shakespeare thing. But he's not totally alone in that. You'll see that going on in the early modern plays. And in fact, you do see quite a few repetitions. I will not is there, I know not is there. So quite a lot going on across. And so Shakespeare is in tune with the playwriting of the time. If you look at the column on the right, that is very different. The only similarity in any other column is the one in green, what do you? All the other ones are different. Now, have a look down that column, and you see this. I'll read them out. I don't know. What do you? I don't want. Do you think? Do you want? I don't think. To do with? Do you know? Going to be? Don't want. Now, I've looked at where these are occurring in the data, and what they are, and you can tell right away, they are fragments of questions and answers. That's what you're getting. And this is a very different way of playwriting, putting together a text from what Shakespeare and his contemporaries were doing. And it relates really to this, I think. This is how we would go and see a play today. You sit in the theatre and you listen to it going on. Note the lighting here. You are in the dark, you're quite isolated, and it's being performed on the stage. You are positioned as the overhearer, right? It's a conversation going on stage, questions and answers, and that is how the playwright is feeding information to you. What do you think about that? The character says it back to that one, and of course you hear this, and then you know what they think. And that's how characterization and plot moves forward. It's through that conversation that is being listened to by the audience. That is not how it worked in the early modern period. The early modern period was much more about direct presentation to you, the audience. The whole setup in the theatre, with the jutting stage. This is the only image from the time. It was written on the back of scrolled on the back of a napkin, a Dutchman who went to a theatre at the time. But anyway, this is, you can see the contact, the connection with the audience, and it's much more about presenting directly. I, blah, 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 and obviously it's soliloquies and sides. It really is direct in that kind of way. So there's much more of a connection with the audience, and so the whole way of actually constructing the text has changed, as you said, dramatically over the years from this direct presentation through to the overheard conversation, and you see it in the Ngrams. These are traces of a massive stylistic shift. Okay, let's go to a second myth. Shakespeare had a larger vocabulary than any other writer. The question, well, as a starting point, how large is the vocabulary size of an educated adult? I have to specify it because obviously it probably makes a difference if you're a child, if you're not modeling. There could be other variables going on here. Interestingly, as I was going through the literature, trying to find an answer to this one, linguists are rather coy about actually specifying anything. After some searching, I came across this in the Applied Linguistics Review, and it claims that most studies are approximately 9,000 to 18,000. And I'm not at all surprised that they don't like delivering a number, and when they give a number, it's a range, because how do you know what a person knows in their head? Are we just talking about the vocabulary they use? Or are we talking about the classic knowledge up in their heads? Even if we're just talking about the vocabulary they use, how are you going to capture all the vocabulary they use and do a count? Yeah, you know, you do give them a microphone for their lifetime and do a count. The challenges are huge. So obviously what they do is they work on the basis, they'll take a samples of language and then work on the basis of how many different words were produced in that sample, and then trying to extrapolate what the implications of that for the total vocabulary. So that's the sort of thing they're working on the basis of. It involves a degree of speculation, for sure. So what about Shakespeare? Okay, so what do people say? Astonishing vocabulary of some 25,000 words. Oh, wait a minute, let's go back. 18, Shakespeare, we're hitting high here. So, okay, 25. Next one. Twice as large as an educated person today. 30,000. My God, genius. Supernatural, in fact. Vocabulary of 20,000 words. Yeah, okay, a little bit more realistic. Interestingly, from a linguist, David Crystal. The other ones, these McCrum and Co., they're really originally journalists. Greenblatt is a very famous Shakespearean scholar. So I'm not picking it out of anywhere. You know, these are important people. But they look kind of tough. Where are these numbers coming from? Okay, that's the key thing. And how do they, count them up? Well, first, what counts as a word when you do the counts? I'm not going to talk about that right now. When I get to the myths about neologisms, I'll come back to word counting and the implications of that. I'm going to talk about this one. It's the kind of assumptions you make in calculating vocabulary size. And it's going to sound ludicrously simple, but this is what they do. So, here we have three authors. Shakespeare, Johnson, Ben Jonson, and George Peele. They're all writing around the same time. And these are the different words that they use in their output. Shakespeare, 21. Ring a slight bell. That's very close to what Crystal said. And that's what Crystal got it from. He counted up the number of different words in Shakespeare's works. Ben Jonson, number of different words, 18,500, which tallies with the earlier range up to 9 to 18,000. George Peele must have been a kid at the time when he was writing, because he's only 6,000. And why is that? Well, Hugh Craig showed exactly what was going on and also provided a solution. So I like this study, so I'm just going to go with the flow and report what he said. This is a dot for Shakespeare, or triangle. So what we have on the vertical axis, a number of different words, and total words used in all of their written works on the bottom. Now, Shakespeare wrote a lot. So he had a bit of an advantage, because the more you write, okay, at the beginning you tend to generate more different words at the beginning, but as you go along, you slow up in terms of your production of different words, you still keep on producing them. You wrote a load of words, and he's got 21,000 up there at the top. Ben Jonson, a little bit behind, and poor George Peele never wrote that much in the first place, which is why he's down at 6,000. Isn't it ridiculous? But that's where these counts are going from. Okay, it doesn't explain other people like McCrum going to 30,000, but that's pulling a number out of the air and just making hazarding a guess at it. I also think what McCrum and co were actually counting as words is an issue there. I'll come to that later. So what's the solution to this? How can we get at a better figure? And this is what Craig did. So what Craig did is he took segments. He took the first 10,000 words of the plays of various authors, and you see the number of segments that he took, 28 Shakespeare there. And then he counted the number of new words in that 10,000 word segment. So it's a level playing field. We've all got 10,000 word segments, yeah? And then he took an average, and the average is on the right hand. And where does Shakespeare come? In the middle. Yeah, and you see actually Webster is at the top with the most dense number of new words coming in. Where's poor George Peele? George Peele's number 3. Yeah, so he's been promoted when you have a level playing field. So you can see by making the wrong, if you like, assumptions about calculating these things, you end up with ridiculous results. As I say, I'll come back to the word counting later. But let's go to myth 3. Shakespeare coined more words than any other writer. I would say this is, certainly in Britain, this is the key myth I hear again and again. Wherever I go, people come up to me and say, oh, I'm so glad to hear you talking about Shakespeare. Didn't he coin all those huge number of words? Anyway, what can we learn from the internet? And honestly, when I really did this, and I had not all of the first few hits of what I actually discovered. So I looked off the internet. Shakespeare coined more words than other writers around 1700. Second hit. The English language owes a great debt to Shakespeare. He invented over 1,700 of our common words. I'm on to a winner. It's 1,700, folks. Next hit. Shakespeare introduced nearly 3,000 words with inflation going on. Then it was another 3,000 hits. Then it was Shakespeare invented a corpus. That's a lot. I mean, he only wrote 21,000 different words. That's not quite a quarter of them. Shakespeare invented half the words in the English language. And the best one for me is this one. Shakespeare is on. You see, I'd love to tell our head of department, forget the Department of Linguistics and English, call it the Department of Linguistics and Shakespeare's language. Anyway, so that's on the internet. What do academics think? And you think they think the same sort of stuff. Here's an old one from 1943. How deep and apparently inexhaustible were the wells of his memory. You see the emotion going on here. And how marvellous his attitude for word coining, all evident from the addition of 302 peculiar words in one play. One play. And got 302 straight off. So you can imagine the numbers are going to be huge. And then this more recent one, 2012. That Shakespeare invented, or at least successfully promoted, more new words than anyone else in history. Is a truth universally acknowledged. How does he know? I've never seen a real count of the number of words that Shakespeare invented, never mind the other writers. So this is just going on the back of emotion and particular ideologies, which I'll get to later. So what is the truth? I have been working on it for a couple of years on the Encyclopedia of Shakespeare's Language project, and partly in conjunction with some wonderful interns, Gerald Banners, Poppy Plum, Sam Holland, who might actually be somewhere here. And we've been trying to get a grip on what is going on. How are we doing it? Well, we take 1,500 words from the Oxford English Dictionary that are recorded as first citations in Shakespeare. This is one method. There are other ways of doing it. This has a few little intrinsic problems to it, but I won't go into those. But that's a starting point, at least. And we're checking these in early English books online. I'm sure Tony McKenna mentioned early English books online, but it purports to be most of printed works around the time of the Renaissance. It runs from like 1400 through to 1700. I've got the dates there, 1473 to 1700. And it's about, it's very difficult to count them up, but I'll say in the order of 1 billion words, something like that. So it's a lot. And then what we can do is we look at Shakespeare and we look before. Can we find an earlier usage of it? So it's about antedating as part of it. Okay, preliminary findings. If the current, we haven't quite finished the work, but if the current pattern continues, less than a quarter of those 1,500 can reasonably be attributed to Shakespeare. It's a few hundred at best. Yeah, so it's nothing like thousands, it's a few hundred. I'd say 300 or 400 at best. Now, the reason I'm saying at best is because ultimately there's an interpretive side to it. And I'm going to explain why that is the case. The problems, the issues. How do we know that Shakespeare coined it as opposed to recorded it? We don't, and we never will. We've just got to try and add an interpretation into that. Now, one of the supposed neologisms that Shakespeare came up with is downstairs. I'm going downstairs. Yeah? Did he really coin that? I suspect it's a recording. It's very mundane. It was around him. There was urbanization going on. People were building houses with more than one story, and they had to go down the stairs. People were using it, and he was just happens to be the first to record it. That's not the case with the next word, incarnadine. It seems to be the case that he was the first one to use it as a verb. Now, incarnadine means to make red. And the reason I think he coined that one is because he needed it in the particular line that he was using it. And the line goes, multitudinous seas incarnadine, making the green one red. Now, multitudinous is a very Latinate word, so it suits the fact that incarnadine is virtually directly from Latin too. He needed a Latin word, and moreover one that would carry the meter. Multitudinous seas incarnadine, all that sort of stuff, iambic pentameter. It fits, it's brilliant, it works. And also that line contrasts with the next one, because we had the Latinate words, and then we have making the green one red, all Anglo-type words. Nice contrast. It suits the slot perfectly. So I think that one you probably coined, the other one probably recorded. I don't know for sure. You have to do the interpretive work. Another thing, if we have words that are borrowed from other languages, and it seems that Latin it was a borrowing around it, possibly Shakespeare was supposed to do it. How do we know that Shakespeare was the first one to take it from a Latin text into English? We have to make a judgment. What happens if it's used in a mixed English-Latin text before Shakespeare? We have to decide, does that count? Is it a borrowing in that text, or do we only wait until it's fully in just an English-only text? So it's a tricky judgment to make. And another thing, is it actually a nonce word? What is a nonce word? We can make up words. I could make up a word for the corner of this table and call it a ting-tang. Okay? I don't know, stupid word. I could call it something. Is that a new word? Not really, because it's just the word I've just made up for the once. That's what a nonce word is, for the once. For a word to become a neologism, it needs to be accepted by a community of users. Okay? So what we've been checking on the project is that it's not just that Shakespeare used it, but did it immediately die, never was used again by anyone else, probably another nonce word, or did it pick up and was it used by future generations? So a lottery, there's no further trace of it. Domineering, we know this word, and it expanded after Shakespeare. So that seems to have taken off. So domineering, I'd say, could be a neologism. The lottery, no. So these are the kinds of problems that you have to deal with neologisms, and there is an interpretive side to it. Let's move to another thing I want to talk. I want to expand a little bit. I mentioned domineering as a case that moves on forward into history. That's something I want to do much more on. Look at the survivals from Shakespeare. And it's very difficult to do it at the word level. And what I've started looking at is particular phrases and how they've moved across time in the English language, and maybe we use them today, perhaps even without knowing it. In fact, I know we use them today often without knowing it, because there was a PhD done at Nottingham University by Sarah Grandish. She went out there and tested various phrases to see if people could recognise those from Shakespeare, and most of them could not. They had no idea. Anyway, so just partly for fun, I'm going to look at, I think it's 5 phrases, and I'm going to use Google's Ngram Viewer. Now, Google's Ngram Viewer, if you want a sort of big mass of material over a long patch of time, it's great. It has some intrinsic problems. I could go into those. Amongst all the stuff, multiple editions are included as different instances. So if you have Charles Dickens going through many editions, they will add the count to the count of Charles Dickens. So there's that kind of skewing going on. So there are difficulties. Nevertheless, there's a big broad brush thing. I think it does show something. So I'm just going to give you a sense of these expressions. So I'll start at the bottom and work my way up. Salad days comes from Antony and Cleopatra, and it bumps along at the bottom there in red, and it's not very interesting, so I'm not going to say more. Band of Brothers in green is much more interesting. There is a spike around 1800, and that's because the military person, Lord Nelson, Admiral Nelson, had, I hope no one's from Denmark here, because there's a battle at Copenhagen, and he trashed the fleet or whatever it was, and he used the term Band of Brothers, and that got picked up by the press, and it accounts for that spike. How do I know that? Because I've gone in and had a look at what was causing that spike. Then there's another little blip around, it's actually sort of late 1850s going on there. That's the Crimea War. And again, it's used in this kind of military context, egging on people or whatever it is. Then we trickle down, and there's a little upturn just after 2000. Can you guess what that is? TV series. Yes, indeed it is. The TV series by it's HBO, I think, and that caused that spike going at the end. Okay, let's do Brave New World. Going along at the bottom in blue, massive spike because Aldous Huxley published a novel called Brave New World. That's largely that one. I won't go any further on that. I find the one that's most interesting in some ways is Sea Change, Tempest. Sorry, Brave New World and Sea Change for the Tempest, Band of Brothers, Henry V. Okay, the blue one, the slightly orangey one, Sea Change, is going along the bottom, and all of a sudden around 1980, it goes massively high. What was going on in 1980? It's because the word sea change was picked up in financial marketing reports. There's been a sea change on the markets this morning, and that's what's driving that. In the 1980s, it was all making money and all the rest of it, and it started promoting that expression. That's what was driving that. Nothing really to do with Shakespeare. But anyway, there you go. Okay, so the interesting life, and we could do lots more on that, but we won't. We're going to move on to the next thing, which is a little digression about counting words. Because if we're thinking about counting words for vocabulary size, or trying to do numbers for neologism, we're counting stuff. And actually, in general, in Corpus Linguistics, we're often counting words. Let's talk about that. It's a natural thing. It's obvious, isn't it? Counting words, we all know what words are. They're in our heads. They're straightforward. And we naturally segment language into written words. We write it down, boom, 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 all straightforward. Or is it? Have a look at this text. To Mum and Dad, I like you and I love you. Love from Emily. How many words? 1, 2, 3, 4. Someone got it. Yeah, 5. Yeah, so you can say 5 words. The interesting thing is, why is there space between love and from? Because this is my daughter, and we're forever giving her cards to sign, and she's learned the convention, having done the love from so often, that you put a space between those words. So actually, spacing between words is entirely conventional. Ancient, some Latin texts were often written with no spaces. Some very early English texts didn't put spaces between prepositions and words, sometimes they were closed up. So the idea of spacing words is conventional. It's not a natural category, just like that. So how do we define it? Well, I know of 4 definitions of what a word is. I'm not going to run through all of them because not all of them are relevant. I'm going to stick to 2. It's a semantic unit of meaning. Blob of meaning that we can extract. Okay, the plane landed 3 words. We all agree? Ish. The plane took off 3 words. Yeah? He kicked the bucket, 2 words. He kicked the bucket, meaning died, an idiom, and therefore 2 bits of meaning, therefore 2 words. So, yeah, the semantic definition gets you so far, but maybe not all the way. And it's particularly tricky when in historical data, because words like indeed, welcome, myself, they're often written separately. And you have to make a judgment about, is it one unit of meaning? I think actually most cases indeed it's one thing. Most cases welcome is one thing. Myself is tricky. Sometimes, particularly in Shakespeare's poetry, he's talking about the self. And he doesn't want myself in a sort of just a straightforward reflexive pronoun. He really wants to emphasize the self. No, anything self there. And so having the space there is actually quite important. So it's a little bit tricky on that one. So how else might we do it? The other definition is the orthographic one. And this is what most corpus linguists use. Here's an example. Orthographic word, a string of uninterrupted, non-punctuation characters with white space or punctuation at each end. So straightforward then, we apply that, not really. And I put some illustrative examples where it doesn't really work. Its compound nouns are an absolute nightmare. They are still tricky today, but in Shakespeare's time, it's all over the show. I was studying hourglass in Shakespeare, because one of the things we're doing like a corpus-based dictionary, and so I have to define everything. So I'm there with hourglass, and in the Shakespeare's folio original text, I find a closed version, hourglass. In an edition, I find with a hyphen, and another one is open. So people are doing all sorts. Now, if you have people doing all sorts across a lot of text, you end up with very different numbers. So what can you do? Well, one of the things we would try and do is bring in the two definitions. You take the orthographic one, but you try and bring in a judgment about whether it's one unit of meaning. And actually, in our class, we are talking about one concept, one article, one item, and so we close them to standardize across the board. So what we were doing is bringing together the orthographic with the semantic definition, using them in combination. It's all you can do. Okay. So it all is fine, we can stop the digression and move on. No, not really. We haven't hit the worst problems. And I suspect this one I'm going to tell you about is the one that accounted for those big word counts. People like saying it's 30,000 words vocabulary for Shakespeare. Because when you pop a text into a concordance society and counts, what is it actually counting? Is it counting word forms or lexims or lemmas, I should say? So what am I talking about? Well, a lemma, a word form is the actual form of the word. The lexeme is all the morphological parts of the word bundled up into a group. And effectively, a dictionary head word is, a lemma is the representative of a lexeme. So do is representing all the forms of do, including do, does, doing, did, done, right? So we would assume, it's do and that's underneath. Unfortunately, in terms of early modern English, it's even worse because you've got do, does, doest, does, doing, did, dids, and done, right? And then if you look at the numbers then, if you're counting lemmas or the representatives of lexemes, it's 1. If you're counting modern word forms, if you count early ones, you've got 8. So you can imagine if someone's chucking in Shakespeare's text into a thing, you can end up with really different word counts on the basis of what in the world you're counting. This is why we have lemmatization in the preparation and processing of text for Corpus programs. And what it's trying to do is to group things together. It takes the morphological forms and recognizes that they are part of the same lemma. And so when you do a search on, say, do, it will allow you to include all the forms of do in one blast. That's today, and it's been cracked more or less for yesterday in early modern English, because it's more complex and there's been less work done on it. It's still prone to error, I would say. Not too bad, but prone to error. Final problem when you're counting words is spelling variation. And I'm going to talk a little about spelling variation in early modern English, but English has never been fully standardized in terms of its spelling. There is still variation particularly depending on the genre. So many online kinds of CMC communication and whatnot, you get lots of variation going on. So you cannot assume there is one way of doing it. Not to mention there are different standards, British, American, etc., etc. So you've got all those complexities going on. For early modern English, my classic example is always the word would, because there's so many different ones. If you typed in W-O-U-L-D in your search program, you'd miss all of those and more. And this is true of many different words. Even a word like sweet. Oh, fine, I'm going to search on that, but it might have been spelled with an E at the end. There's so much, so you have to regularize all that in one way or another. Unfortunately, we used a particular program devised by generations of scholars from the linguistics department here, and latterly given a massive shove by Alistair Barron, who developed the second generation of it. It's quite a user-friendly tool, and you can pop your text in there, and it can regularize in automatic mode, or it'll help you do assisted manual mode. And so when I've been using it, it's often assisted manual. And it gives you options to regularize to things like that. If we're thinking, you have to make a decision about what to regularize to. For today's English, you might think, well, do I want to regularize to American spelling or British spelling? The problem with Shakespeare is there wasn't a standard at that time. Spelling standardized much later in the 17th century. Shakespeare's time, it wasn't one. So what did we actually do? Our policy was essentially, it is the answer for the whole lot. We prioritized the orthographic definition of words using the semantic one where necessary. We distinguished lexemes, often modern texts for Shakespeare. They get rid of all this grammatical stuff and they smooth it out. If you look at the one in the middle, plural forms, shoes is what we have today. In Shakespeare's time, you could say sure. Now, if you're a linguist, you're interested in that. But in many modern editions, they get rid of all that to make it easier for the reader. But actually, for me, that's like bad news. But so we didn't get rid of it, and we regularized spellings to basically the most frequent one in Shakespeare would be the one we regularized to. That seemed like the most sensible thing to do. So we had to make those decisions. Okay, let's get back to myths. Myth 4. Shakespeare's language transcends time and space. This is a myth that's gone on for decades, and I think Ben Jonson kicked it off. He did a dedication to the first folio, which was published in 1623, and he was extolling Shakespeare, etc. And you can't quite see it there, but it says, he was not of an age, but for all time. Yes. Universal characters, emotions, themes. Yes, I can. Yeah, sure. I agree with that. Language? Not so sure. But some people swallow that one and say it's true of language too. The most obvious quote I've come across is this one. I'll come back to this quote later. So I'll read it out. Shakespeare has given us a universal language medium in which are crystallized the battle hymns, the intellectual conceptions, and the spiritual aspirations of the Anglo-Saxons. It's a universal language medium. We just all talk Shakespeare, right? It's ludicrous, I know. And what we've been trying to do on the project is actually no one's really attempted to put Shakespeare in context systematically using corpus methods. So we have early English books online, we have a matching corpus of contemporary playwrights, and we're looking at what Shakespeare means in relation to those, we're looking at the meanings elsewhere, in contemporary, then come back to Shakespeare, etc., etc. So that's what we're trying to do, put it all in context. The resources, we couldn't have done that project until quite recently because of the lack of resources. And it's, if anything, it's EBO, Early English Books Online, that's doing it for us. But those resources enable us to put it in the fullest linguistic context. We can look at the contemporaries and we can look at things like this. Who was using it? What were they talking about? Where? And how often in early modern English? We do all that kind of stuff. I know you've gone through English Books Online a bit with Tony, so I'm just going to flash this up. This is Early English Books Online, in case you want a refresher on the details. It's massive, it's great, it's good comparison. We had to work a bit on it because the metadata is not that good. But we've worked harder on it, on a section of it, in order to grasp exactly what's going on. What I want to get through is to a little illustrative example of how it is patently absurd to say that Shakespeare has this universal language. It's like saying language doesn't change. It does, of course it does. And I'm going to illustrate with the word bastard. So I looked in, for today, to get a handle on it, it's in your heads, of course, but I looked in the British National Corpus to get a handle on it. Overwhelmingly frequent in spoken data. Now, my takeaway there is it's quite colloquial, yeah? Co-occurs with negative terms, fat, lazy, dirty, and you. You lazy bastard, you can see the so it's a generic term of abuse directed at somebody, okay? Let's go back to yesterday, and I'm using Early English Books Online. Overwhelmingly frequent in informational and often formal instructional texts. My takeaway is not colloquial, not back in Shakespeare's time. It veers towards being a technical term. Very different. Co-occurs strongly with botanical and plant terms. Carthamus, rhubarb, parsley, and lots of flowers. What is going on? It's a botanical term. And that's because its basic meaning was that it's a hybrid. It means a hybrid, essentially. It's a hybrid flower. It's a hybrid plant. There's a minor pattern, co-occurrence pattern. This is a very minor one in Shakespeare's time, where it goes along with negative terms like brat, coupled, concubine. And so although generally, as I've got it there, it means genetically hybrid, is what it means. There's this minor pattern of not of legitimate parentage, socially inferior. And that's the minor pattern going along in Shakespeare. So when we read it in King Lear, thou cursed bastard, a lot of it is saying, you know, you've got the wrong parentage, you're hybrid here, and you're of a lower status. Yeah, and it's very different, it's not colloquial, it's partly a technical term describing the parentage of the addressee. That's really what's going on. Because you can see how the term of abuse has developed, the abuse today has developed out of that. But what this method does is it gives you hard empirical evidence of what it meant at that time. It can actually nail it. Okay, final myth. This is quite a quick one. Shakespeare had small Latin. Now, again, Ben Jonson set this one off because in his dedication, which you've seen already, here's another bit. And though thou hadst small Latin and less Greek, actually sounds quite condescending. You know, you didn't know any Greek, you know, small Latin, a little bit of Latin, and there's a whole thing about, because the thing that marks Shakespeare out compared with his contemporaries is he didn't go to university. He was a grammar school boy. And so some people have interpreted that as a sort of snobbish remark. They're saying you're not a proper university playwright, you just went to grammar school, you didn't know the classics properly, didn't know your Latin. There have been commentators now who have said, well, actually, even though in grammar schools at the time, they learned a lot of Latin. And so actually the basis of that is a bit. And the other thing to bear in mind is that Johnson himself was a remarkable classicist. He knew a huge amount of Latin and Greek. So compared with Johnson, it's probably true that Shakespeare knew less. So if you know those things, yeah, you can reinterpret that a bit. It's not quite a condescending remark. But it remains an empirical question. Was Shakespeare actually using less Latin than his contemporaries? So I set out to find out whether he was using less Latin. So how did I do it? Right? What we did on the project is we manually coded as Latin every word that had, this is partly using VARD, the program, the spelling regularizer allows you to code for other categories too. So what we did is any word that had a plausible Latin spelling profile and either contrast with surrounding English words was part of a cohesive chunk of other plausible Latin words, and then we code it as Latin. I could give you examples of that, but for reasons of time, I'm going to keep on going. Assisted by the variant detector VARD. That produced a broad list of Latin candidates, but we wanted a more robust list, so we did some exclusions. We excluded mock Latin expressions. Sometimes people cooked it up. It wasn't real Latin, it was just making it up. And we excluded ambiguous cases. Sometimes the form of the word in Latin is identical in French, or in Italian, or in Spanish. And so if we had an ambiguous word, we discounted it. We excluded proper nouns. So, you know, sometimes you have Octavia in Cleopatra, we rid of that. And we excluded stage directions. Exeunt, omnes, all that kind of stuff. This is Latin, it's in stage direction, not in the dialogue. That left this kind of stuff. Saying our bona fide in Latin, this is the top 50 items. And so, but it's longer list than this, it's just top 50. And so we've taken that list, we then tracked it in Shakespeare's plays and the plays of a matching set. We created this corpus of contemporary playwrights, and you can see the results. Shakespeare corpus, types 245, tokens 362, comparative corpus 28, tokens 74. So resoundingly, on both in terms of types of tokens, it's Shakespeare where you've got this mass of Latin going on. Now,
raw numbers or relative?
These are raw numbers. Yeah.
Are the sizes the same of these two?
Yes, they are. Yes, we designed it that way, and we designed it to match. Actually, there is a methodological thing which I don't know whether you spotted. There's a flaw with this thing. I still think the result is correct, so I'll be amazed if there's a difference, but there is one problem. What we did is we took the list from Shakespeare, and we were looking to see if those words were in the contemporary.
But it's the other way around.
Yeah, we cannot guarantee that there might be other Latin words there, right, that actually would boost the numbers for the comparative corpus. However, those differences are so great, and we've got a very wide list. Is it really the case that there'd be so much other Latin in those other playwrights? I think it's extraordinarily unlikely. It's something I need to check in the future, but for now, I'm kind of happy with the way we're going. I think this is just a myth that he had small Latin. He actually knew a lot of Latin. He got it from grammar school and that kind of stuff. And he was partly self-taught. There's evidence he was reading Latin and teaching himself text, so that's another thing. Okay, concluding reflections. So, Shakespeare and the myths. Why are there all these myths? I've been through them, and I haven't got through all of them, in fact. There's a myth-making factory going on. And actually, let's go back to this quotation here. If you look at the date, it's 1918, 1922. And the myth-making factory starts towards the end of the 19th century. It's during the days of the Anglo-Imperial Empire, and at this particular point, actually, it was declining. And what they needed is a national poet who, never mind these other Goethe and all these other ones from other countries, it's going to be Shakespeare who's going to coin, he's got superhuman powers, we're going to have him coining all those words and doing this and doing that. It's just reflecting the ideology. It was convenient to pump up Shakespeare and churn out all these myths that then became part of popular folklore and got recycled and all that kind of stuff. But actually it doesn't kind of match up with the empirical truths. Having said that, it may sound as if I'm mocking Shakespeare. If Shakespeare really coined even 100 new words, that is amazing. Yeah. Other writers go through their entire literary career and don't coin one. So if you've got 100, it's like brilliant. So let's just get real, I would say. That's the message with Shakespeare more than anything else. So okay, so I've talked about the myths. And hopefully, aside from the myths, I've covered a few other bits and bobs along the way, which might be of interest. The notion of a word, spelling variation, words and lexemes and lemmas, just kind of that. Ngrams, counting assumptions, always be careful. Meanings and collocations, a little bit of that, not so much. Corpus linguistics and lexicography, a little bit of that going on in the background. Corpus linguistics, historical linguistics, looking at Igbo in the broader perspective, etc., etc. I've touched on those. Hopefully, you've got something from it. But I'll stop there. Thank you very much. That is bang on 1 hour. And so, if you have an appointment somewhere else, just go. Since I have to chair myself, I will invite, say, a couple of questions if you want to ask a couple of quick ones, but if you need to go, just go. So maybe I'll take a couple of questions and then I'll hover at the end as well. So a couple of questions if you have any. Burning questions. If you want to go, I'm going to hover here for a bit. Do I see someone with a hand? Yeah, hand there. Right, go for it.
I was wondering about the size of words. You said you looked up and you found that the sources are citing people having between 9,000 and 20,000. Was that what the range was that you found?
For today, yeah,
For
9,000,
today's
18,000.
English. And so I was wondering about that. I mean, is that meant to be recognition vocabulary or productive vocabulary that people can?
I think it's productive.
Yeah,
because they're extrapolations on the basis of counts of different words used across samples, and that's what they're doing. But it is fiendishly difficult to come up with anything accurate, which is why people are coy about giving numbers, and quite rightly they give a range. That's what they do.
But it still seems small to me because now they have all this child language acquisition. I thought by the time children get to be about 10 and they're carefully tracking them all, I thought they had at least that many.
Yes.
So,
yeah. Me too, but I'm not an expert in that
yeah.
area. I can see a couple of hands up, but I feel some people want to go. So I'm going to hover here, and if you want to come down and ask them individually, do that.
I want to ask something about tradition.